This the summary of Guns, Germs and Steel. The Fate of Human Societies by Jared Diamond. Summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Bill. Disclaimer. This is an unofficial summary and analysis of Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. It is not the original book and is not affiliated with or authorized by the author or publisher. This work is intended to provide key insights, analysis, and commentary for educational and informational purposes only. All names, trademarks, and references to the original content remain the property of their respective owners. Every effort has been made to ensure fair use under Section 107 of the Copyright Act. Readers are encouraged to purchase the original book from the author or publisher for the full experience and context. Introduction. Why do some societies grow into empires with advanced technology while others remain small and isolated? Why did Europeans, armed with guns, germs, and steel, conquer so much of the world instead of the other way around? In this book, Jared Diamond sets out to answer these difficult questions, not by claiming that one group of people is more intelligent or more capable than another, but by tracing how geography, environment, and resources shaped the path of human societies. The argument is simple but powerful. Where people lived, what plants and animals they could domesticate, and how their lands allowed ideas and technologies to spread determined their fate. The story begins with the starting line, when all humans were hunter-gatherers. From there, it follows the rise of farming, the domestication of animals, and the spread of deadly germs that wiped out entire populations. It explains how writing, centralized governments, and organized religions grew out of these conditions, and how the uneven distribution of food and resources tilted history in favor of some societies over others. Guns, Germs, and Steel is not just about the past. It challenges us to think about the present and future. It argues that human inequality is not the result of innate differences between people, but of environmental luck and historical chance. Chapter 1. Up to the starting line. Human history did not start in cities or farms. It began with small bands of hunter-gatherers, people who moved with the seasons, carrying little more than tools, fire, and knowledge of the land. For millions of years, this was the only way to live. By 11,000 BC, every continent except Antarctica had been settled by these mobile communities. The world's people all stood on roughly the same starting line, armed only with stone tools, hunting skills, and the ability to adapt. But the environments they entered were not equal. Africa, the cradle of humanity, had already lost many of its large animals to earlier human hunters. Eurasia still held powerful wild horses, cattle, and goats. The Americas had giant sloths, mammoths, and camels. But within a short span, these creatures vanished, likely hunted to extinction or lost to climate shifts. Australia's giant marsupials disappeared too, leaving people there with no large animals to tame. From the very beginning, the lottery of geography quietly tilted the future. By 11,000 BC, the world's continents held very different toolkits. In the Fertile Crescent, stretching through parts of modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, wild grains like wheat and barley grew thick across the hills. Goats, sheep, and pigs roamed nearby, animals that could eventually be domesticated. In contrast, indigenous Australians had no such candidates for farming. They became masters of fishing, fire management, and plant gathering. But without domesticable crops and animals, they remained tied to a mobile life. The Americas offered both abundance and limits. Corn, beans, squash, and potatoes would later transform human diets, but these crops required centuries of slow cultivation before they became reliable. Large animals were scarcer. Without horses or oxen to pull plows, American civilizations relied on human muscle alone. which shaped the way their societies grew. At this early point in history, no society was more intelligent, no people more ambitious than another. Every group of humans had the same brainpower and creativity. What differed were the resources under their feet. Geography placed some people in regions rich with plants and animals waiting to be domesticated, while others lived in lands where survival would always depend on hunting, fishing, and gathering. This unequal distribution of resources explains why farming emerged in some places thousands of years before others. Agriculture allowed people to stay in one place, store food, and support larger populations. Larger populations produced specialization: soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and leaders. The chain reaction of settled farming societies would, in time, produce guns, germs, and steel. So, at the starting line, all humans were equal in ability, but not in opportunity. The continents themselves handed out different cards, shaping what each society could become. This was not destiny written in human nature, but in soil, climate, and biology. Chapter 2. A Natural Experiment of History. Imagine hundreds of tiny islands scattered across the Pacific, some green and lush with rainforests, others bare and windswept. This is Polynesia, where adventurous seafarers spread out thousands of years ago, carrying with them the same starting package of crops, animals, and skills. They left from the same homeland, spoke related languages, and shared cultural roots. Yet when Europeans finally arrived centuries later, they found astonishing differences. Some islands held simple villages, while others supported powerful chiefdoms and organized armies. Why such variety, given their shared beginnings? Jared Diamond treats Polynesia as a natural laboratory, where geography became the silent hand shaping societies. On the Hawaiian Islands, volcanic soils were fertile, rainfall was abundant, and land was vast. People could farm intensively, grow dense populations, and support political hierarchies. Over time, this produced chiefs, warriors, and monumental architecture. Hawaiians became known for their canoes, fish ponds, and strict social rules that reinforced power. Contrast that with the Chatham Islands, far to the south. Cold, windy, and poor in resources, the land could not support farming. The settlers there, called the Moriori, had to abandon agriculture and return to hunting and gathering. Populations remained small, scattered into bands that lived simply and cooperated to survive. There was no space for chiefs or armies. Peace and sharing became their way of life. Now, picture Tonga, where rich soils and a favorable climate allowed a surplus of food. This abundance fed thousands and gave rise to complex societies with kings, nobles, and commoners. Tonga's leaders commanded fleets of war canoes and controlled trade across the seas. Meanwhile, other smaller islands, short on resources, never grew beyond a handful of villages. The striking part is that these differences cannot be explained by intelligence, motivation, or culture. All Polynesians came from the same heritage. What changed was the environment. Fertile lands pushed people toward dense populations and centralized power, while harsh islands limited them to small egalitarian groups. History took another turn when outsiders arrived. In the 1800s, Maori from New Zealand invaded the Moriori of the Chathams. The Maori came with ships, weapons, and a military organization. The Moriori, who lived peacefully and had no tradition of warfare, were powerless to resist. Within a few years, their population was massacred or enslaved. The tragedy revealed, in brutal form, how geography had written two very different paths for societies that once shared the same ancestors. This Polynesian experiment offers a small-scale preview of the world's larger story. When groups with different environments developed at different speeds, those with more productive lands and resources gained power. They built stronger weapons, larger populations, and organized leadership, while others were held back by their surroundings. Geography, once again, had tilted the scales. Chapter 3. Collision at Cajamarca. In November 1532, two worlds collided in a dusty plaza in Cajamarca, Peru. On one side stood the Inca Empire, stretching thousands of miles along the Andes, a civilization of millions with roads, palaces, and armies. At its head was Atahualpa, the emperor, carried on a golden litter, surrounded by thousands of loyal warriors. On the other side was Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish adventurer with just 168 men, a handful of horses, and some steel weapons. By every visible measure, the Incas should have crushed the Spaniards. Instead, the opposite happened. When Atahualpa agreed to meet Pizarro, he expected an easy encounter. His scouts had seen the strange men and their animals, horses unlike anything in the Andes, but he dismissed them. His army numbered in the tens of thousands, his empire was vast, and the Spaniards looked few and unimpressive. Atahualpa's confidence grew even greater because his people were recovering from a civil war. He had just defeated his brother Huáscar, and the victory made him feel untouchable. But Pizarro and his men carried hidden advantages. They had steel swords and armor, sharper and more durable than anything the Inca had ever faced. They had horses, which turned battle into a shock of speed and terror for foot soldiers who had never seen such animals before. They carried guns, crude by modern standards but frightening in their noise and smoke. Equally important, they carried germs. Unknown to the Inca, smallpox had swept through South America ahead of the Europeans, killing huge numbers, including the former emperor. The disease weakened the empire, leaving it vulnerable even before the Spaniards arrived. When Atahualpa entered Cajamarca's square, he came without weapons. His army camped nearby, confident their sheer numbers were enough. A friar stepped forward and offered him a Bible, demanding he accept Christianity and submit to Spain. Confused and angered, Atahualpa threw it aside. That was the signal Pizarro needed. From hiding, the Spaniards charged. Horses thundered into the plaza. Guns roared. Steel swords cut through unarmed men. The Inca, packed tightly and unprepared, panicked. Thousands were slaughtered, while not a single Spaniard was killed. In the chaos, Pizarro himself seized Atahualpa, dragging the emperor from his golden seat. By nightfall, the mighty ruler of the Andes was a prisoner of a tiny foreign band. The capture of Atahualpa was not just a dramatic moment. It symbolized a turning point in global history. How could a small group of Europeans defeat the heart of a great empire? The answer lay not in bravery or genius alone, but in long histories of food production, animal domestication, technology, and disease. The Spaniards inherited these tools from their geography and environment. The Inca, brilliant as they were, had not been given the same resources by their land. What looked like a miracle of conquest in Cajamarca was really the product of thousands of years of unequal development, tilting the balance before the two sides ever met. Chapter 4. Farmer Power. The Spanish victory at Cajamarca was not only about steel and horses, it was about what made those weapons and animals possible in the first place: farming. Agriculture had been the quiet engine behind the power of civilizations long before Pizarro set foot in the Andes. When people learned to grow food, instead of relying solely on hunting and gathering, everything changed. A field of wheat or barley could feed far more mouths than a patch of wild berries or a successful hunt. This meant populations could grow. More people meant larger communities, and larger communities could support specialized workers. craftsmen who made tools, soldiers who trained for battle, and leaders who managed resources. Farming was the root of social complexity. But it wasn't just about food. Farming societies also lived in close contact with domesticated animals: cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. These animals provided more than meat. They gave milk, wool, hides, and muscle power for plowing and transport. They also shared their diseases. Over generations, farmers' bodies developed resistance to illnesses like smallpox and measles, diseases that would later devastate populations who had never known them. This hidden advantage of germs proved as powerful as guns or steel. When Europeans carried their diseases to the Americas, epidemics swept through native populations, often before direct contact was made. The Inca and Aztec empires had already been weakened by waves of sickness before Spanish soldiers appeared. Farming societies, in essence, had been preparing for conquest unknowingly through centuries of living side by side with livestock. Agriculture also fueled technology. With surpluses of food, societies could afford to invest time in experimentation. Metalworking, writing, and organized armies grew from this foundation. Farmers could feed soldiers who did not farm, scribes who recorded information, and inventors who pushed tools beyond stone. Compare this to hunter-gatherer groups. They could live skillfully off the land, often healthier, and with more leisure than early farmers. But their numbers stayed small. A band of a few dozen could not compete with a kingdom of thousands supported by farms. Over time, even if farming brought harder labor and new risks, it allowed those who adopted it to spread, displace, or absorb those who didn't. The Spaniards who marched into Cajamarca carried weapons forged in societies with centuries of farming behind them. Their steel swords were possible because metal workers had long been freed from food production. Their horses came from ancestors domesticated on Eurasian plains. Their immunity to disease came from generations of exposure in crowded farming villages. None of these advantages was the product of recent brilliance. They were the result of farming's deep compounding power. This chapter shows how the quiet act of sowing seeds and raising animals set the stage for empires. It was agriculture that fed the growth of guns, germs, and steel, the very tools that toppled mighty kingdoms when worlds collided. Chapter 5. History's Haves and Have-Nots. Not all lands were created equal when it came to the birth of farming. Some places overflowed with wild plants and animals ready for domestication. Others offered very little. This uneven distribution of resources created winners and losers long before the first empires rose. The Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Israel, was especially blessed. Its hills and valleys held wild wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, all nutritious and capable of being stored for long periods. Herds of goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle roamed nearby, animals that could eventually be tamed and bred. People in this region could move relatively quickly from gathering to farming, laying the foundation for large, settled societies. Other parts of the world had a harder starting point. Australia had no native grains suitable for domestication and no large animals that could be harnessed for labor. Sub-Saharan Africa had crops like sorghum, millet, and yams, but these were more difficult to store and less calorie-rich compared to wheat or barley. The Americas offered maize, beans, and squash, which were revolutionary in their own way, but it took thousands of years to breed maize from its wild ancestor, teosinte, into a staple food. Large animals were an even greater limiting factor. Out of all the world's species, only about a dozen were ever domesticated successfully. Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, camels, and a few others. Most came from Eurasia. The Americas lost many of their big mammals, like mammoths and giant sloths, to early hunting and climate change. Africa had plenty of wildlife, but most species, like zebras and rhinos, proved impossible to tame. Australia had none at all. Without large domesticated animals, societies could not pull plows, carry heavy loads, or move quickly across land. These differences shaped population growth. In regions rich in domesticable plants and animals, people could settle, store food, and support larger families. Populations expanded, villages turned into towns, and towns into states. In areas with poor candidates for farming, populations stayed smaller, often tied to hunting and gathering. The gap in development widened with every generation. It's easy to think of history as the story of cleverness or ambition, but this chapter makes it clear. Much depended on luck. The Fertile Crescent's farmers did not invent their wheat or sheep. They simply lived where these resources already existed. Meanwhile, people in New Guinea or southern Africa were just as capable, but their land gave them fewer tools to work with. Over time, these early advantages piled up. Regions with the best crops and animals developed dense populations, complex societies, and advanced technologies sooner than others. Geography quietly sorted the world into history's haves and have-nots, long before ships, empires, or guns crossed the seas. Chapter 6. To farm or not to farm. When we look back, farming seems like the obvious choice. Why wouldn't people prefer a steady supply of crops over the uncertainty of hunting and gathering? Yet the decision was not so simple. For thousands of years, farming spread unevenly, sometimes quickly, sometimes not at all. The reasons reveal how people weighed survival, opportunity, and risk. In some regions, farming took hold almost immediately. Once people in the Fertile Crescent discovered how to plant wheat and barley, the advantages were clear. Harvests could be stored to last through winters and droughts. Herding animals meant a constant source of meat, milk, and hides. Populations grew, villages formed, and the farming lifestyle became permanent. But in other places, hunting and gathering remained attractive for much longer. Wild game could provide protein without the back-breaking labor of tilling fields. In many climates, nuts, fruits, and fish were plentiful. Farming, by contrast, was risky. A poor harvest could mean starvation, while hunters and gatherers could move to new grounds when supplies ran low. Even in areas where crops existed, people adopted farming only when they had to. For example, indigenous groups in North America continued to rely on rich supplies of fish, deer, and wild plants for centuries before maize cultivation became central. They were not behind or less capable. They simply had enough resources without farming. The pressure to farm usually came from rising populations. As groups grew larger, wild resources could no longer support everyone. Farming, though harder work, produced more calories per acre. It allowed communities to feed more people on the same land. In time, farming societies outnumbered their neighbors, pushing them aside or absorbing them. Geography again played a role in speed. In Eurasia, crops and animals could spread more easily across lands that shared similar climates along an east-west axis. A crop that thrived in Mesopotamia could also grow in Greece or Spain. In the Americas and Africa, however, north-south axes forced crops to cross vastly different climates, slowing the spread. The story of farming is not one of instant triumph, but of gradual trade-offs. Farming brought bigger food supplies, but it also brought harder labor, crowded living, and disease. Yet it set in motion the changes that would lead to writing, cities, and empires. The uneven spread of agriculture explains why some societies grew dense and powerful, while others remained smaller and mobile. It wasn't a question of one being smarter or lazier. It was about when farming became necessary, what crops were available, and how geography allowed those crops to move. The choice to farm, or not to farm, was the turning point that determined which societies would build the first complex civilizations and which would continue to live more lightly on the land. Chapter 7. How to make an almond. The first farmers did not set out to create new crops. They began simply by gathering the plants that seemed most useful, grains that filled the stomach, fruits that tasted sweet, nuts that lasted through the seasons. But over time, something subtle and extraordinary happened. The plants themselves began to change, shaped by human choices, until they became unrecognizable from their wild ancestors. Take the almond. In its wild form, the almond seed is laced with bitter, poisonous chemicals. A single bite could make you sick. Yet now and then, a tree would produce a nut that was sweet and edible. Ancient gatherers, without knowing genetics, favored those rare nuts. They ate them, planted them, and spread them. Over generations, sweet almonds became more common. Slowly, the poisonous kind faded into the background, and the almond as we know it today was born. The same quiet transformation happened with wheat and barley. Wild varieties scatter their seeds easily, a clever trick for survival in nature, but frustrating for humans who want to harvest. Farmers noticed that some stalks held onto their seeds longer. Those were the ones they collected, threshed, and replanted. Season after season, the crops became more cooperative. Eventually, wheat and barley stopped scattering their seeds entirely. An accidental gift of domestication. Corn tells an even stranger story. Its ancestor, a grass called teosinte, looked nothing like the golden ears we know. Teosinte had tiny kernels hidden in hard shells, almost useless as food. Yet early farmers in Mexico saw potential. They gathered plants with slightly bigger kernels, planted them, and repeated the process. Across thousands of years, teosinte transformed into maize, one of the most important crops on Earth. What began as scraggly grass became the backbone of civilizations. Humans were not scientists in these early days, but they were excellent observers. They noticed which plants grew well, which tasted better, which stored longer, and which filled a family's stomach. Each choice acted like a small experiment, nudging plants along a new evolutionary path. Domestication was not a conscious invention. It was the product of countless decisions made by ordinary people over centuries. The process also reveals why some regions had an advantage. Places rich in wild plants that responded quickly to human selection could develop farming earlier. The Fertile Crescent, again, offered wheat, barley, peas, and lentils that could be domesticated relatively easily. Other regions, with plants that resisted domestication or provided little nutrition, advanced more slowly. What looks ordinary to us today, the apple, the pea, the sunflower, are the results of deep human partnership. These plants do not exist in their current form in the wild. They are human-made companions, molded by patience and repetition. The act of turning wild plants into crops was one of humanity's greatest revolutions, though it unfolded quietly in fields and gardens without fanfare. It was not kings or generals who made it happen, but farmers, gatherers, and families choosing, season after season, which seeds to save. Chapter 8. Apples or Indians? Across the globe, not all societies had the same luck with crops. Some regions were filled with plants that lent themselves easily to domestication, while others had fewer options. This uneven spread of usable plants helps explain why farming flourished in some lands and lagged in others. Eurasia was especially fortunate. Its lands hosted wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas, lentils, chickpeas, grapes, and olives. These plants not only grew well, but were also rich in nutrients and easy to store. A diet built from them could sustain dense populations. Add to this the domestication of apples and grapes, which provided sweetness and variety, and it's clear why Eurasia's farming cultures expanded so strongly. In contrast, the Americas had fewer staple crops at the start. Their treasures, maize, beans, squash, and potatoes, were revolutionary, but needed long periods of selective breeding before they became reliable. Maize, in its early form, produced tiny kernels and offered little nutrition compared to fully developed wheat. Potatoes, while rich in calories, grow underground and require careful handling to store and spread. Over centuries, indigenous farmers transformed these crops into powerhouses, but the process slowed the growth of farming societies in the Americas compared to Eurasia. Then there was New Guinea, where people worked with bananas, taro, and sugarcane. These foods sustained life but lacked the high protein and storage qualities of wheat or beans. They supported smaller populations and limited the scale of societies. New Guinea remained rich in cultural creativity, but was not positioned to build the same kind of expansive empires as Eurasia. The difference was not about intelligence or creativity. People everywhere were skilled at working with what they had. The key was what nature offered in the first place. If a region had plants that could be domesticated into calorie-dense, long-lasting staples, it had a head start. If not, progress toward larger, more complex societies moved more slowly. Geography also determined how widely these crops could travel. Eurasia, stretched east to west, allowed crops to spread across lands with similar climates. Wheat domesticated in the Fertile Crescent could grow in Spain or India with little change. By contrast, the Americas and Africa stretched north to south, across radically different climates. A crop that thrived in Mexico might fail in the high Andes or the cold Great Plains. The spread of agriculture was slowed not by people's reluctance, but by nature's boundaries. This uneven distribution of useful plants shaped the balance of history. Eurasia, filled with easily domesticated crops, grew food surpluses that fed armies, builders, and inventors. Other regions advanced too, but at a different pace, constrained not by ability, but by what the land provided. What looks like a simple difference in apples, grains, or potatoes was, in fact, the foundation of global inequality. The plants people had at their disposal would determine how far and fast their societies could grow. Chapter 9. Zebras, Unhappy Marriages, and the Anna Karenina Principle. While plants shaped the rise of farming, animals were just as important. Domesticated animals pulled plows, carried loads, gave milk and wool, and served as living engines of civilization. But only a tiny fraction of the world's wild species could ever be tamed. Why cows and horses, but not zebras or lions? The answer lies in a principle Diamond borrows from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. All successful domestic animals share the same set of traits, while those lacking even one are destined to fail. First is diet. A domesticable animal must eat plants that humans can provide. Carnivores demand too much meat to be efficient. Herbivores and grazers, like cattle, sheep, and goats, fit the bill. Second is the growth rate. An animal must reach maturity quickly to be useful. Elephants, for example, take 15 years to grow up, far too long for farming societies to manage. Third is breeding. Creatures that resist mating in captivity are almost impossible to domesticate. Cheetahs and many antelope species simply refuse to reproduce when confined. Fourth is temperament. No one wants to raise animals that are dangerously aggressive or unpredictable. This is why cattle became a cornerstone of farming while African buffalo remained wild. Fifth is social structure. Animals with natural hierarchies, herds led by dominant individuals, are easier to domesticate. Humans can take the role of a leader, guiding the group. Sheep, goats, and horses all follow this pattern. Solitary animals, like many deer, cannot be controlled in the same way. Finally, the problem of panic. Some species respond to stress by bolting and never returning. Antelopes and gazelles are famous for this. Horses, on the other hand, can be startled but are trainable. Together, these traits explain why, out of more than 150 large mammal species, only about 14 were ever domesticated. Most came from Eurasia: sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, horses, camels, donkeys, and a few others. The Americas had llamas and alpacas, useful in the Andes, but limited elsewhere. Africa, despite its vast wildlife, produced none. Zebras resisted taming with violent bites and unpredictable tempers. Elephants, while trainable, were never truly domesticated. They remained too slow to breed and too costly to maintain. This uneven success in animal domestication gave Eurasia enormous advantages. Horses transformed travel and warfare, pulling chariots and later carrying cavalry that reshaped battlefields. Oxen plowed fields, boosting food production. Goats and sheep offered milk, wool, and hides. Beyond food and transport, these animals became partners in survival. And with them came germs. Living in close quarters with livestock exposes humans to diseases that jump from animals to people. Over time, Eurasian populations built immunity. When these diseases spread to the Americas or Australia, they wiped out populations with no such defenses. The story of animals is not one of equal opportunity, but of strict requirements. Only those species that passed all the tests could stand beside humans. The few that did transformed societies, while the many that failed left others without the same tools for power. Chapter 10. Spacious Skies and Tilted Axes. The spread of farming and animals across the globe was not just about what species existed, it was also about geography. Some regions allowed crops and livestock to travel easily. Others threw up barriers that slowed or even stopped their movement. The secret lay in the shape of the continents themselves. Eurasia, stretching thousands of miles from east to west, enjoyed what might be called a geographic gift. Lands along the same latitudes shared similar climates, day lengths, and growing seasons. Wheat, first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, could thrive in Greece, Italy, and Spain with little change. Horses raised on the steppes of Central Asia could survive in France or China. Knowledge, seeds, and animals could move along this horizontal axis with relative ease, spreading innovations across the continent. By contrast, the Americas and Africa stretched mainly north to south across very different climates. Maize, domesticated in Mexico, faced challenges moving into the cool highlands of the Andes or the temperate zones of North America. It needed centuries of selective breeding to adapt to new conditions. Potatoes, perfect for the Andean mountains, could not handle the heat of the tropics. Africa presented similar difficulties. Sorghum and millet thrived in the savannas, but moving these crops southward meant crossing the equator, where rainfall patterns, soil, and seasons were completely different. Crops and animals often failed when pushed too far from their home environments. This slowed the spread of agriculture and limited how quickly societies could grow. Geography also created barriers beyond climate. The deserts of the Sahara, the dense Amazon rainforest, and the towering Andes Mountains each acted as walls. While Eurasia had its own challenges, deserts like the Gobi, mountains like the Himalayas, its vast, continuous stretches of land allowed for much freer movement compared to the fragmented landscapes of other continents. This difference explains why farming spread so quickly across Eurasia compared to the Americas or Africa. Within a few thousand years, crops, animals, and technologies connected distant societies, from Mesopotamia to China to Europe. In contrast, American societies remained more isolated, with maize, potatoes, and llamas largely confined to their regions of origin. Africa, too, developed rich agricultural traditions, but the north-south axis and environmental obstacles slowed their exchange. The tilt of the Earth shaped history as surely as steel or gunpowder. People everywhere were equally creative, but ideas and resources could only spread as fast as geography allowed. Eurasia's horizontal shape gave its societies a massive advantage in sharing crops, animals, and technologies. Elsewhere, innovation often stayed local, brilliant but contained. What seems like a simple fact, the direction a continent stretches, quietly determined the speed of progress, the rise of populations, and ultimately the power that some societies carried into encounters with others. Chapter 11. Lethal Gift of Livestock. Farming gave people food, animals, and tools for building complex societies. But it also gave them an invisible inheritance, deadly germs. This gift of livestock reshaped human history, often more than swords or arrows ever could. When people began living with animals, cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep, they shared more than barns and fields. They shared microbes. Many of the world's most feared diseases began as animal infections that jumped to humans. Measles came from cattle. Influenza traces back to pigs and ducks. Smallpox likely came from livestock, too. In crowded villages where people lived close to their herds, these germs thrived. At first, the results were devastating. Epidemics swept through early farming communities, killing thousands. But over centuries, survivors passed on their resistance. Populations gradually developed immunity, not complete protection, but enough to withstand outbreaks. What had once been overwhelming became survivable. Diseases like measles or chickenpox, deadly at first, turned into childhood illnesses that most people could recover from. The situation was very different in societies without livestock. In the Americas, for instance, llamas and alpacas were domesticated but did not spread the same range of diseases as Eurasian animals. As a result, native populations had little exposure to the germs that Eurasian farmers lived with for millennia. Their bodies had not built resistance. This difference lay hidden until the great collisions of the 15th and 16th centuries. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they carried with them invisible armies, smallpox, measles, influenza, and more. These germs spread faster than the conquerors themselves. Entire cities in the Americas collapsed before Europeans even arrived, emptied by disease. Populations dropped by as much as 90%, not from war, but from microscopic invaders. The same happened in Australia and the Pacific Islands. Contact with Europeans unleashed epidemics that shattered communities. Guns and steel mattered, but germs cleared the way long before battles were fought. It's striking to think that animals gave humanity milk, meat, wool, and muscle power, but also the most lethal of companions. Yet those who endured gained something powerful: biological resilience. A society's long, painful history with livestock diseases turned into a weapon when it encountered populations that had never faced them. This lethal gift was not intentional. It was biology playing out across centuries. Still, it shaped the balance of power. Eurasian societies carried a hidden shield and sword in their immune systems, honed by generations of exposure. Others, through no fault of their own, met those germs for the first time with catastrophic results. The rise of agriculture wasn't just about feeding people. It was about creating the environments where diseases could evolve, spread, and eventually decide the fate of continents. Chapter 12. Blueprints and Borrowed Letters. Once food surpluses supported larger societies, new challenges arose. How do you govern thousands of people? How do you keep track of harvests, laws, and trade? Out of these needs came one of humanity's most powerful tools: writing. Writing was not invented everywhere. It first appeared in only a few places, independently: Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. In each case, it grew out of practical needs, not artistic inspiration. In Mesopotamia, the earliest clay tablets recorded grain shipments and taxes. Bureaucracy, not poetry, sparked the first scripts. But once invented, writing spread widely, often borrowed and adapted rather than reinvented from scratch. Societies copied letters and systems from their neighbors, reshaping them to fit their own languages. The alphabet used across Europe, for example, traces back to the Phoenicians, who themselves borrowed from earlier scripts. This borrowing saved enormous effort. Instead of creating symbols from nothing, people built on existing blueprints. Diamond points out three main paths by which writing spread. Some societies developed it independently, like the Sumerians. Others received it directly, like the Greeks from the Phoenicians. Still others borrowed indirectly, adjusting systems from afar. The Japanese writing system, for instance, grew from Chinese characters, though it eventually adapted into something distinct. Why didn't everyone develop writing on their own? Because not every society needed it. Small communities could govern themselves without elaborate record-keeping. Oral traditions preserved history, and law just fine. Only when societies grew large, with taxes, armies, and trade networks, did writing become essential. Writing transformed power. Leaders could issue laws that reached far beyond their sight. Armies could coordinate with written orders. Merchants could track debts and contracts. Knowledge could be stored outside the human mind, available to future generations. Societies with writing gained enormous advantages over those without it, not because they were smarter, but because they had the right conditions to develop or adopt it. The spread of writing was also shaped by geography. Just as crops and animals traveled more easily across Eurasia's east-west axis, so too did alphabets and scripts. From Mesopotamia to Greece to Rome, systems of writing moved, adapted, and expanded. In contrast, in the Americas, writing systems like the Mayas remained more isolated, without the chance to spread. Chapter 13. Necessity's Mother. When we think about inventions, it's tempting to picture lone geniuses struck by sudden brilliance. Edison with the light bulb, Gutenberg with the press. But Diamond challenges this myth. Most inventions did not arise from pure need or inspiration. They often began as curiosities, tinkering, or accidents, and only later found a purpose. Take Thomas Edison's phonograph. When he built it in 1877, he imagined uses like recording the last words of the dying, preserving family messages, or teaching spelling. None of these became the device's lasting purpose. Instead, the phonograph reshaped music and entertainment, an outcome Edison barely mentioned. The same pattern appears again and again. Invention often precedes necessity. People create things without knowing exactly why, and society later discovers how to use them. Gunpowder was first mixed in China for fireworks, not warfare. The internal combustion engine existed before automobiles. Even writing, first designed for tracking grain and taxes, became the foundation of literature and science. Diamond argues that four forces shape how inventions spread. First, economic advantage. If a technology makes work easier or cheaper, it is more likely to take hold. Second, social value and prestige. Objects tied to status, like silk or cars, spread quickly. Third, military advantage. Tools that aid in conquest, like guns or iron weapons, spread almost instantly. And fourth, compatibility with existing practices. Technologies fit best when they can be slotted into daily life without dramatic change. Equally important are the networks of exchange. A society might invent something brilliant, but if it remains isolated, the invention dies quietly. In Eurasia, dense populations and trade routes created constant sharing. One society's experiment became another's breakthrough. By contrast, in the Americas and the Pacific, isolation meant that many innovations never left their region of origin. This explains why invention was not uniform across the globe. It wasn't that some people lacked creativity. It was that some environments allowed inventions to spread and compound, while others kept them contained. A wheel invented in Mesopotamia rolled across Europe and Asia. A wheel invented in Mesoamerica stayed local, used on toys rather than carts, because there were no large animals to pull wagons and fewer roads to connect distant places. Technology, then, is not the product of necessity being the mother of invention, but rather invention becoming the mother of necessity. People often created tools first, and societies later discovered the problems those tools could solve. The process was messy, unpredictable, and deeply tied to geography and social context. Seen this way, history is not a tale of brilliant inventors, but of countless experiments, most forgotten, some adapted, a few world-changing. The societies that flourished were those where geography, population, and connections allowed inventions to multiply and spread. Chapter 14. From Egalitarianism to Kleptocracy. For most of human history, people lived in small, mobile groups. These bands or tribes had little hierarchy. Everyone knew each other, decisions were made collectively, and leaders, if they existed, held power only by persuasion. But as societies grew larger, this simple system broke down. Governing hundreds or thousands of strangers required new forms of organization, and with them came inequality. Diamond traces this shift from small egalitarian groups to chiefdoms and then to states. In chiefdoms, leadership became hereditary. Chiefs demanded tribute, food, goods, or labor from their people. To justify this, they often claimed religious authority, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods or connected to ancestors. The tribute they collected was not purely selfish, however. Chiefs used it to support warriors, craftsmen, and priests, which in turn strengthened the community's power. States, even larger than chiefdoms, developed full bureaucracies. Leaders now had armies, tax collectors, and scribes to enforce laws and manage resources. At this scale, inequality was unavoidable. A ruling elite sat above commoners, supported by systems of tribute or taxation. These leaders often enriched themselves, but they also had to provide something in return to keep society stable. Diamond uses the term kleptocracy, literally rule by thieves, to describe elites who take resources from the masses. But he stresses that kleptocracies survive only when they give back enough benefits to justify their existence. A ruler who steals everything loses support quickly. Successful rulers redistribute wealth in ways that make people accept or even welcome their authority. They do this in four main ways. First, by disarming the population and keeping weapons in the hands of loyal soldiers. Second, by redistributing goods in a way that seems fair, such as organizing feasts, building monuments, or supporting religious ceremonies. Third, by using part of their wealth to maintain order, infrastructure, and defense, which benefits everyone. And fourth, by claiming ideology or religion that portrays their rule as natural or divinely sanctioned. This transformation from equality to hierarchy was not about intelligence or morality, but about scale. Small groups could survive without centralized authority, but larger ones needed systems to manage food, security, and disputes. The price of complexity was inequality. The rise of kleptocracy also explains why farming societies, despite heavier labor and social divisions, often overcame hunter-gatherer groups. Organized states could mobilize armies, store food, and enforce order in ways that smaller bands could not. Even if life for commoners was harsher, the structure of states made them powerful and enduring. What began as simple communities of equals evolved into vast stratified societies with kings, emperors, and priests at the top. These leaders took much, but gave back just enough to hold their power. And with that exchange, the foundation for complex civilizations was set. Chapter 15. Yali's People. The book circles back to where it began, with Yali's question in New Guinea. Why did Europeans arrive with so much cargo, while his people had so little? To answer, Diamond looks at New Guinea itself, one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse regions in the world, yet one where societies developed very differently from Eurasia. New Guinea is home to thousands of years of human settlement. Its people practiced forms of agriculture long before Europeans landed, cultivating taro, yams, bananas, and sugarcane. They also kept pigs and chickens, but compared to Eurasian farming, these crops and animals had limits. Taro and yams spoiled quickly and couldn't be stored the way wheat or rice could. They offered fewer calories and less protein, which constrained population growth. The animals were useful, but did not provide the same power as horses or oxen for plowing and transport. Geography made matters harder. New Guinea's rugged mountains, isolated valleys, and thick forests divided groups from one another. Unlike Eurasia's broad east-west landmass, where crops and livestock could spread easily across similar climates, New Guinea had sharp ecological barriers. Farming techniques that worked in one valley often failed in the next. This fragmentation created extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity, hundreds of languages across a relatively small area, but it also slowed the diffusion of innovations. Population size mattered too. Smaller, scattered groups had fewer people to experiment with technology and fewer networks to share discoveries. If one group abandoned a tool or technique, it often disappeared entirely, rather than being preserved somewhere else. By contrast, in Eurasia, innovations had a much larger pool of users and were more likely to survive and spread. When Europeans arrived, these differences played out dramatically. Guns, steel, and germs gave them enormous advantages. But those advantages were not born of superior intelligence, as some once argued. New Guineans were, in fact, highly skilled in survival, adaptation, and ecological knowledge, far more adept at living off the land than most Europeans. The disparity in cargo arose from geography, not biology. Diamond emphasizes that this conclusion dismantles racist explanations for inequality. The differences between New Guinea and Europe stemmed from the availability of domesticable plants and animals, the ease of spreading them across land masses, and the resulting ability to support large, interconnected populations. With more people came more innovation, more resistance to disease, and more capacity to build powerful states. Yali's people lived in a world of abundance in some ways: lush forests, rich biodiversity, deep cultural traditions, but their geography set limits on what could be stored, spread, and scaled up. Europe's advantages were accidents of environment, not destiny of intelligence. By returning to New Guinea, Diamond ties together the threads of the book. The question Yali asked was never about personal ability. It was about the forces of geography and biology that shaped the fate of societies long before ships sailed into new harbors. Chapter 16. How China became Chinese. China's story is striking because it combines both enormous diversity and remarkable unity. Thousands of years ago, the land we now call China was not a single nation, but a patchwork of peoples, languages, and cultures. Like Europe, it had many competing states. But unlike Europe, China eventually unified into one of the largest and most enduring political entities in history. Understanding how that happened sheds light on why societies develop so differently. In the early days, China was home to multiple centers of agriculture. Rice was first cultivated in the wet lowlands of the south, while millet thrived in the drier north. These regions supported very different ways of life, from fishing villages to farming settlements. Over time, they blended, with technologies, crops, and ideas flowing between them. Instead of remaining permanently divided, these regions gradually came together. Geography played a key role. While Europe's mountains, peninsulas, and seas kept its peoples apart, China's heartland was dominated by two great rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze. These rivers, along with the flat plains that surrounded them, created natural connections. Crops, trade, and armies could move across the landscape more easily. Diversity existed, but it was more connected and less isolated than in Europe. By the time of the first emperors, this geography made political unification possible. Dynasties rose and fell, but the idea of a single, centralized China persisted. A shared writing system further bound the people together. Even when dialects differed so greatly that speakers could not understand one another, the characters they used on paper were the same. This unity of script gave China a tool that Europe never fully had. The benefits of unification were immense. Resources could be mobilized across vast territories, armies coordinated, canals built, and inventions spread quickly. Technologies like paper, gunpowder, and the compass originated in China and reached far-off lands because a massive unified population supported innovation and diffusion. Yet, there were trade-offs. In Europe, political fragmentation meant constant rivalry. Competing states pushed one another to advance militarily, economically, and technologically. If one king rejected an idea, another might embrace it. Innovation found multiple outlets. In China, a single centralized authority could either encourage or suppress change. At times, emperors supported exploration and invention. At other times, they closed doors, halting progress for centuries. This contrast between unity and fragmentation shaped world history. Europe's rivalry fueled its overseas expansion, while China's unity built stability, but also periods of stagnation. Neither path was inevitable. Both were products of geography, crops, and political history. The process by which China became Chinese was not a simple story of conquest, but of integration, of diverse peoples slowly woven into one civilization. It shows how geography can push societies toward unity or division, and how that choice shapes the course of history for centuries to come. Chapter 17. Speedboat to Polynesia. Far out in the Pacific Ocean lies one of the greatest human stories of exploration, the settlement of Polynesia. Thousands of islands, scattered across a vast stretch of water, became home to people who sailed there in wooden canoes long before Europeans ever ventured so far. Diamond uses this story as a natural experiment to show how geography shapes societies. All Polynesians descended from the same ancestral group that set out from Asia, carrying with them crops, animals, and sailing skills. Yet, after settling on very different islands, their societies evolved in radically different ways. Some remained small and simple. Others became stratified kingdoms with chiefs, armies, and monumental architecture. Take the contrast between the tiny rocky island of Vanuatu and the fertile, expansive lands of Hawaii. Anuta, with limited soil and resources, could support only a few hundred people. Life there required strict cooperation and careful sharing of food. Society stayed egalitarian, with little hierarchy. In Hawaii, by contrast, rich soils and abundant resources allowed large populations to grow. Over time, a powerful ruling class emerged, supported by farmers and fishermen. Chiefs built temples and commanded warriors, creating a sharply stratified society. The same differences appeared across other islands. Tonga developed into a complex chiefdom with widespread influence, while places like Tikopia remained relatively small-scale. On Easter Island, limited resources and isolation pushed people to carve massive stone statues, but also led to deforestation and population collapse. Geography dictated what was possible, what crops grew, how many people could live there, and how leaders organized them. Even technology and warfare were shaped by the environment. On some islands, where stone was plentiful, people developed advanced tools and weapons. On others, where resources were scarce, they relied on simpler tools or imported goods through trade. Some islands supported standing armies and fortifications. Others had no need for them. What makes Polynesia so valuable for understanding human history is that its people began with the same cultural toolkit: similar languages, crops like taro and breadfruit, and animals like pigs and chickens. The only major difference was geography. And that difference explains why societies diverged so sharply. This speedboat to Polynesia offers a miniature model of the broader world. Just as Polynesians adapted to islands of varying size and fertility, societies across continents adapted to their environments. Geography shaped whether they became egalitarian or hierarchical, peaceful or warlike, small villages or large kingdoms. The Polynesian experiment shows that history is not predetermined by culture or intelligence. It is steered by the resources, constraints, and opportunities of the land itself. From tiny Anuta to mighty Hawaii, the fate of each society was written not in their blood, but in their geography. Chapter 18. Hemispheres Colliding. When Europeans set sail across the oceans, two worlds that had been separated for thousands of years suddenly met. The collision between the Old World and the New World was not an equal meeting. Europe arrived with steel weapons, powerful ships, and devastating germs. The Americas, despite their rich civilizations, faced enormous disadvantages in this encounter, rooted not in intelligence but in geography and history. Eurasia had been home to dense populations, large domesticated animals, and centuries of interaction between different societies. This constant contact spread technologies and hardened immune systems. Smallpox, measles, and influenza were already familiar foes, deadly but survivable for those who had built resistance. In the Americas, where llamas were the largest domestic animal and human populations were more scattered, such diseases had never evolved. When Europeans brought them across the ocean, native communities had no defenses. Epidemics raced ahead of conquistadors, wiping out entire cities before a single battle was fought. Beyond germs, there were differences in technology. Europeans had iron and steel, giving them swords and armor unmatched in the New World. They had guns, not yet perfect, but terrifying to those who had never seen them. They had ships capable of carrying men, animals, and supplies across oceans. The Inca and Aztec empires, though sophisticated, had no equivalent. Their weapons were made of wood, stone, and bronze, and they fought largely on foot. Writing also played a role. In Eurasia, written records allowed knowledge to spread widely and endure. Conquistadors like Cortés could read about earlier encounters, learning strategies for conquest. In the Americas, where writing systems like the Mayas had not spread widely, knowledge was more local and oral. This difference meant that Europeans could coordinate across generations and continents in a way native societies could not. Food production shaped these contrasts. Eurasia's crops, wheat, barley, rice, produced more calories and could be stored for longer than maize or potatoes in their early forms. This supported larger armies and populations. Domestic animals not only provided food, but also labor and transport. Horses gave Europeans speed and shock power in battle, something unimaginable for societies without large riding animals. When the hemispheres collided, all these advantages compounded. It was not a matter of superior bravery or cleverness. It was a chain of historical developments set in motion thousands of years earlier. Geography had given Eurasia the raw materials for larger, more connected societies. And those societies carried their tools, germs, and ideas across the seas. For the peoples of the Americas, this collision was catastrophic, leading to conquest, collapse, and dramatic cultural change. For Europeans, it opened vast new lands and resources. The meeting of hemispheres reshaped the world. But the imbalance was not about destiny. It was about the long, uneven paths by which different societies had grown apart, only to meet again in sudden, transformative contact. Chapter 19. How Africa Became Black. Africa, the cradle of humankind, holds one of the richest tapestries of human diversity on Earth. Yet over time, the continent's peoples shifted, languages spread, and new populations replaced or absorbed older ones. Diamond explores how Africa came to look the way it does today, why certain groups dominate large regions, and why the continent's map of peoples is so complex. Early humans first evolved in Africa, and for tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherers roamed the land. Even today, groups like the San of southern Africa and the Pygmies of Central Africa carry echoes of that ancient way of life. But beginning around 3,000 years ago, Africa underwent sweeping changes driven by food production and migrations. The key was the Bantu expansion. Originating in what is now Nigeria and Cameroon, Bantu-speaking farmers carried with them crops, iron tools, and domesticated animals. As they spread south and east, they displaced or absorbed hunter-gatherer populations. Their farming supported larger populations than foraging could, and their iron weapons gave them military advantages. Over centuries, Bantu languages spread across most of sub-Saharan Africa, leaving behind the linguistic map we see today. But the story is not only about Bantus. North Africa was shaped by influences from the Middle East and Mediterranean. Crops like wheat and barley, along with sheep, goats, and cattle, arrived early from the Fertile Crescent. Later, Arabs brought Islam and camels, transforming trade and culture across the Sahara. In the Horn of Africa, contact with the Middle East created unique blends of languages and traditions. Ethiopia, for example, developed its own written script and maintained Christianity for centuries amidst Muslim neighbors. Geography again explains much of this pattern. The Sahara Desert acted as a formidable barrier, but was eventually bridged by camel caravans. The tropical forests of Central Africa slowed farming expansions, but iron tools allowed people to clear land more effectively. Diseases like malaria and sleeping sickness, carried by mosquitoes and tsetse flies, also shaped settlement, limiting where livestock could thrive. These environmental factors determined who could live where and which economies would succeed. The phrase "Africa becoming black" refers not to skin color alone, but to the dominance of certain peoples and languages over others. Hunter-gatherer groups with lighter skin tones in some regions were gradually replaced or assimilated by darker-skinned Bantu farmers. This shift was not about innate superiority, but about the advantages of food production, technology, and numbers. By the time Europeans arrived, Africa's demographic map had been largely redrawn. The continent was home to powerful kingdoms like Mali, Great Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia, each shaped by a blend of local resources and outside influences. What looked like timeless divisions of Black Africa were in fact the product of millennia of migrations, adaptations, and ecological constraints. Africa's story shows once again that history's deepest patterns are written in geography, crops, animals, and disease environments. Human choices mattered, but they played out on a stage set long before by the land itself. Chapter 20. The Future of Human History as a Science. Diamond closes his book by looking forward. He asks, can the study of history ever be a science, like biology or geology? Many historians resist that idea, saying history is too complex, too dependent on individual choices and unique events. But Diamond argues that if we step back far enough, patterns do emerge, and those patterns can be studied scientifically. Throughout the book, he has shown how geography, food production, germs, and technology shaped societies in systematic ways. These are not random accidents, but recurring forces. Civilizations that had access to certain crops, animals, and favorable geography tended to grow larger and more powerful. Those without such advantages faced limits. The same environmental principles that explain why Polynesian islands developed differently also help explain why Eurasia came to dominate the world. To Diamond, this does not mean history can predict every twist and turn. No science can forecast every detail. Biology cannot predict the exact path of evolution, but it can explain why some species thrive while others vanish. Similarly, history cannot foretell the rise of a specific leader or the outcome of a single battle, but it can uncover the deeper laws that shape the broad sweep of human societies. He envisions a future where history and science work together. Archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and ecology are already providing hard data about past migrations, crops, and population changes. These tools can reveal why some societies advanced faster than others. They also show that human history is not simply a string of unique stories. It is a field where patterns repeat and where causes can be identified. This scientific approach also challenges old myths. For centuries, people explained inequality between nations by appealing to differences in race, intelligence, or culture. Diamond's research overturns those ideas. The real drivers were geography and biology. Who had wheat? Who had horses? Who lived close to deadly germs? Who could share inventions across wide regions? By focusing on these material factors, history becomes less about blaming or praising peoples and more about understanding the forces that shaped their possibilities. Looking ahead, Diamond believes this perspective matters for our present and future. The inequalities of the modern world still trace back to ancient differences in food, land, and environment. Recognizing that helps us address global issues with more clarity. It shows that today's disparities were not inevitable or natural, but the product of long historical processes. In the end, Diamond hopes for a history that stands alongside the natural sciences, offering explanations grounded in evidence and logic. Not a science that erases human choices, but one that places them within the larger web of forces that guide the rise and fall of civilizations. The future of history, he argues, is to be both humanistic and scientific, to tell stories, but also to uncover the laws beneath them. This has been the summary of Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fate of Human Societies by Jared Diamond, summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Bill.